Chapter 6 Nar the Spider. I had little difficulty making out the tallest tower in Nar, the cylinder of the Ubar Marlinius. As I dropped closer, I saw that the bridges were lined with the celebrants of the planting feast, many perhaps reeling home drunk on paga. Flying among the cylinders were Tarnsmen, cavalry warriors reveling in the undisciplined liberty of the feast, racing one another, essaying moss passages at arms, sometimes dropping their tarns like thunderbolts toward the bridges, only to jerk them upward just inches above the terrified heads of the celebrants. Boldly I dipped my tarn downward into that midst of the cylinders. Just another of the wild Tarnsman of Gor. I brought him to rest on one of the steel projections that occasionally jut forth from the cylinders and serve as tarn perches. The great bird opened and closed his wings, his steel-shod talons ringing on the metal perch as he changed his position, moving back and forth upon it. At last satisfied, he brought his wings against his body and remained still, except for the alert movements of his great head and the flash of those wicked eyes, scrutinizing the streams of men and women on the many nearby bridges. My heart began to beat wildly. I considered the faculty with which I might yet wing my way from Gor. Once a warrior without a helmet flew near, drunk, and challenged me for the perch. A wild Tarnsman of low rank, spoiling for a fight. If I had yielded the perch, it would have aroused suspicion immediately, for on Gor the only honorable reply to a challenge is to accept it most promptly. "May the priest kings blast your bones," I shouted, as cheerfully as I could, adding for good measure, "and may you thrive upon the excrement of Thalarians." The latter recommendation, with its allusion to the loathed riding lizards used by many of the more primitive clans of Gor, did seem to please him. "May your tarn lose its feathers," he roared, slapping his thigh, bringing his tarn to rest upon the perch. He leaned over and tossed me a skin bag of paga, from which I took a long swig, then hurled it contemptuously back into his arms. In a moment he had once more taken flight, bawling out some semblance of a song about the woes of a camp girl, the bag of paga flying behind him, dangling from its long straps. Like most Gor compasses, mine contained a chronometer, and I took the compass and turned it over, pressing the tab that would snipe open the back and reveal the dial. It was 2 minutes past the 20th hour. Vanished were my thoughts of escape and desertion. I abruptly forced my tarn into flight, once more streaking for the tower of the Ubar. In a moment it was below me, and I dropped immediately, for no one, without good reason, rides a tarn in the vicinity of the tower of an Ubar. As I descended, I saw the wide, round roof of the cylinder. It seemed to be translucently lit from beneath, a bluish color, and in the center of the circle was a low, round platform, some 10 paces in diameter, reached by 4 circular steps that extended about the perimeter of the platform. On the platform, alone, was a dark-robed figure. As my tarn struck down upon that platform, and I leaped from its back, I did hear the girl scream. Lunging for the center of the platform, and breaking under my foot a small ceremonial basket filled with grain, I kicked from my path a kalnatrena, splashing the fermented liquid across the stone surface. I raced to that pile of stones at the center of the platform, the girl's scream in my ears. From a short distance away, I heard the shouts of men and the clanking of arms as warriors raced up the stairs to the roof. Which was the homestone? I kicked apart the rocks. One of these must be the homestone of Ar, but which? How could I tell it from the others, the homestones of these cities which had all fallen to Ar? Yes, it would be the one that would be red with Kolnana, that would be sprinkled with the seeds of rain. I felt the stones in frenzy. Several were damp and dotted with grains of sartana. I felt the heavily robed figure dragging me back, tearing at my shoulders and my throat with her nails, pitting me against all the fury of a very enraged body. I swung back, forced her from me. She fell to her knees and crawled to one of the stones. Seizing it up, she turned to flee. A spear shattered on the platform near me. Guards were on the roof. I leapt over the heavily robed figure. I seized her, spun her round, and tore from her hands the very stone she carried. She struck at me, pursuing me to the tarn, which was excitedly shaking its wings, preparing to forsake this tremulous roof of the cylinder. I leaped upward and seized the saddle ring, inadvertently dislodging the mounting ladder. In an instant I had attained the saddle of the tarn. I drew back savagely upon the one strap. The heavily robed figure was trying to climb that mounting ladder, but was impeded by the weight and ornate inflexibility of her garments. I cursed as an arrow creased upon my shoulder, and the tarn's great rings smote the air, and the monster took flight. He was in the air, and the passage of arrows sang within my ears, the cries of the enraged men, and the long, fierce, terrified scream of a girl. I looked down, dismayed. The heavily robed figure was still clinging desperately to the mounting ladder. She was now clear of the roof, swinging free below the tarn, with the lights of Ar dropping rapidly into the distance below her. I drew my sword from its sheath to cut the mounting ladder from the saddle. But I stopped. Angrily I drove the blade back into its sheath. I couldn't afford to carry the extra weight, but neither could I bring myself to cut the ladder free and send the girl to her death. I cursed as the frenzied notes of tarn whistles drifted up from below. All the Tarnsman of Gor would be flying tonight. I passed the outermost cylinders of Ar and found myself free in the Gorean night, streaking for Korriba. I placed the homestone upon the saddle pack, snapping the lock shut, and reached down to haul in the mounting ladder. The girl whimpered in terror. Her muscles and fingers seemed frozen. Even after I had drawn her to the saddle before me and belted her securely to the saddle ring, I had forced her fingers from the ring of the mounting ladder. I folded the ladder and fastened it in its place at the side of the saddle. I did feel sorry for the girl, a helpless pawn in the Sari's man game of empire, and the tiny animal noises she uttered did move me to pity. "Do not be afraid," I said. She trembled, continuing to whimper. "I won't hurt you," I said. "Once we are beyond the swampy forest, I'll set you down on a highway to Ar. You'll be safe." I wanted to reassure her. "By morning, you'll even be back in Ar," I promised. Helplessly, she seemed to stammer some incoherent words and turned trustfully to me. She put her arms around my waist, as though for additional security. I felt her trembling innocent body against mine, that dependence upon me. Then suddenly she locked her arms around my waist, and with a cry of rage, hurled me from the very saddle. In that sickening instant of falling, I realized that I had not fastened my saddle belt in that wild flight from the roof of the U-bar cylinder. My hands flung out, grasping at nothing, and I fell headlong down into the night. I remember hearing for a moment, fading like the wind, her triumphant laughter. I felt my body stiffening in the fall, setting itself for the impact. I remember wondering if I would feel that crushing jolt, and supposing that I would. Absurdly, I tried to focus on loosening my body, relaxing the muscles, as if it would make any true difference. I waited for that oncoming shock, was conscious that flashing pain of breaking through the branches, and that plunge into some soft, articulated, yielding substance. I then lost conscience. When I opened my eyes, I found myself partially adhered to a vast network of broad, elastic strands that formed a structure, perhaps a pasong in width, and through which at numerous points projected the monstrous trees of the swamp forest. I felt the network, or the web, tremble. I struggled to rise against it, but found myself unable to gain my feet. My flesh was adhered to that adhesive substance of those broad strands. Approaching me, stepping daintily for all of its large bulk, prancing over the strands, came one of the many swamp spiders of Gor. I fastened my eyes on the blue sky, wanting it to be the last thing that I looked upon, and I shuddered as the beast paused near me. I felt the light stroke of its forelegs, felt that tactile investigation of those sensory hairs upon its appendages. I looked at it, and it peered down, with its 4 pairs of pearly eyes, quizzically, I thought. Then, to my astonishment, I heard a mechanical voice say out, "Who are you?" I shuddered, believing at least my mind had broken. In a moment the voice repeated the question, the volume of the sound being slightly increased, and then added, "Are you from the city of Ar?" "No," I said, taking part in what I believe must be a fantastic hallucination, in which I had madly conversed with myself. "No, I am not," I said. "I am from the free city of Koraba." When I said this, the monstrous insect bent near me, and I caught sight of its mandibles, like large curved knives. I tensed myself for that sudden lateral chopping of those pincer-like jaws. Instead, some saliva, or some related type of secretion, was being applied to the web within my vicinity, which loosened its adhesive grip. When freed, I was lightly lifted in those mandibles and carried to the edge of the web, where the spider seized a hanging strand and scurried downward, placing me upon the ground. The beast then backed away from me upon its 8 legs, never taking its pearly gaze of its several eyes from me. I once more heard the mechanical reproduced sound again. It spoke. "My name is Nar, and I am of the Spider people." I then saw for the first time that strapped to his abdomen was a translation device, not unlike those that I had seen within Koraba. It apparently translated sound impulses below my auditory threshold into the sounds of human speech. My own replies were undoubtedly similarly transformed into some medium this insect could understand. One of the insect's legs twiddled with a knob on the translation device. "Can you hear this?" he asked. He had reduced the volume of the sound to its original level, the level to which he had asked his original question. Yes, I spoke. The insect seemed relieved. I am pleased, he said. I do not think it is appropriate for rational creatures to speak so loudly. You have saved my life, I said. I thank you. My web saved your life, corrected the insect. He was still for a moment, and then, as if sensing my apprehension, said, I will not hurt you. The spider people do not hurt rational creatures. I am grateful for that, I said. The next remark took my very breath away. Was it you who stole the homestone of R? I paused then. Being confident the creature had no love for the men of R, I decided to answer affirmatively. This pleases me, said the insect, for the men of R do not behave well toward the spider people. They hunt us and leave only enough of us alive to spin the Kulan fiber used in the mills of R. If they were not rational creatures, we would slay them. How do you know the homestone of R was stolen? I asked. Word has spread from city, carried by rational creatures, whether they crawl or fly or swim. The insect lifted a foreleg. The sensory hairs trembled upon my shoulder. There is great rejoicing on Gar, but not in the city of R. I lost the homestone, I said. I was tricked by her. I supposed to be the daughter of the Ubar, thrown from my own torn, and saved from my death only by your web. I think tonight there will again be gladness in Gar, when the daughter of the Ubar returns the homestone. The mechanical voice spoke again. How is it the daughter of Ubar will return the homestone when you carry in your belt the Tarn goad? Suddenly I realized the truth of what he had said, and were amazed that it had not occurred to me before. I imagined the girl alone upon the back of the fierce Tarn, unskilled in mastery of such a mount, without even a Tarn goad to protect herself if the bird should turn upon her. Her chances of survival seemed now more slim than if I had actually cut the ladder over the cylinders of R, when she hung helplessly within my power. The treacherous daughter of the Ubar Marlanius. Soon the Tarn would be feeding. It must have been light for several hours. I must return to Korava, I said. I have failed. I will take you to the edge of the swamp, if you like. I assented, thanking him. This rational creature, who lifted me gently upon his back, and moved with such dainty rapidity, picking his way exquisitely through the swampy forest. We had proceeded for perhaps an hour, when Nar the Spider abruptly stopped. Lifting his 2 forelegs into the air, he tested the many odors, straining to shift out something in that dense human air. Carnivorous Tharlan, a wild Tharlan in vicinity, he spoke. Hold tight. Luckily, I did immediately as he had advised, fixing my grip deep upon the long black hairs that did cover his thorax. For Nar suddenly raced to a nearby swamp tree, and scuttled high within its branches. About 2 or 3 minutes later, I heard the hunger grunt of a wild Thorn, and a moment afterward, the piercing scream of a terrified girl. From the back of Nar, I could see the marsh, with its reeds and clouds of tiny flying insects below. from a wall of reeds about 50 paces of the night, came the 30 feet below, stumbling and screaming, the bundled figure of a human being, running in horror, its hands flung out before it, and in that instant I recognized the heavy brocaded robes, now covered in mud, of the daughter of the Ubar. Scarcely had she broken into the clearing, splashing through those shallow greenish waters near us, than that fearsome head of a wild Tharlan poked through those reeds, its round shining eyes gleaming with excitement, and its vast arc of a mouth swung open, almost too rapid to be visible. A long brown lash of a tongue darted from its mouth, and curled around that slender, helpless figure of the girl. She screamed hysterically, trying to force that adhesive band from her waist, as it began to withdraw toward the mouth of the beast. Without thinking it through, I leaped from the back of Nar, seizing one of the long tendril-like vines that parasitically interlaced the gnarled forms of the swamp trees, and in an instant I had splashed into the marsh at the foot of the tree, and raced toward the Tharlan, my sword raised. I had rushed between its mouth and that of the girl. Then with a swift downward slash of my blade, I severed that foul brown tongue. A shattering squeal of pain rent the heavy air of the swamp forest, and the Thalorian actually reared upon its hind legs and spun about in pain, sucking that brown stump of its tongue back into its mouth with an ugly popping noise. Then it splashed upon its back in the water, rolling quickly onto its legs, and began to move its head in rapidly scanning motions. Almost immediately, its eyes fixed upon me, its mouth, now filled with a colorless scum, opened, revealing its teeth ridges. It charged, its great webbed feet striking the marsh water like explosions. In an instant the mouth had snapped for me, and I had left the mark of my blade deep upon the teeth ridges of its lower jaw. Once more it snapped, and I knelt, the jaws passing over me as I thrust upward with the sword, piercing that neck. It backed away to about 4 or 5 paces, slowly, unsteadily. Its tongue, or rather the stump of its tongue, flitted in and out of its mouth at 2 or 3 times, as if the creature could not understand that the weapon was no longer at its disposal. The Tharlan sank a bit lower in the marsh, half closing its eyes. I knew the fight was over. More of its colorless exuded was seeping from its throat. About its flanks, as it settled in the mud, there was a stirring in the water, and I realized the smaller water lizards of the swamp forest were engaged upon their grisly work. I bent down, and I washed my blade and my sword, as well as one could within that green water, but my tunic was so splattered and soaked that I had no way to dry the blade. Accordingly, carrying the sword in my hand, I waded back to the foot of the swamp tree, climbed the small dry knoll upon its base. I looked around. The girl had fled once more. This made me angry, for some reason, though I did think myself well rid of her. After all, what did I expect? That she would thank me for saving her life? She undoubtedly had left me to the Tharlan, rejoicing in the luck of an Ubar's daughter, that her enemies might destroy one another, while she escaped with her life. I wondered how far she would get within the swamps before another Tharlan caught her scent. I called out, "Nar!" looking for my spider comrade, but he, like the girl, had disappeared. Exhausted, I sat with my back against the tree, my hand never leaving the hilt of the sword. Idly, and with much repulsion, I watched the body of the Thalian in the swamp. As the water lizards fed, the carcass lightened, shifted position, and rolled in the water. Now, in a matter of minutes, the skeleton was now visible. Picked almost clean, the bones gleamed, except where the small lizard skittered about, seeking a last particle of flesh. There was a sound, and I leaped to my feet, my sword at the ready. But across the marsh, with his swift prancing stride, came Nar, and in his mandibles held gently, but most firmly, the daughter of the Ubar Marlinus. She was striking at Nar with her tiny fists, cursing and kicking in a manner that I thought most improper for the daughter of an Ubar. Nar pranced onto the knoll and set her down before me, his pearly luminescent eyes fixed upon me like a blank expressionless moon's. "This is daughter of the Ubar Marlinus," said Nar, and added ironically, "She did not remember to thank you for saving her life, which is strange, is it not, for a rational creature?" "Silence, insect," said the daughter of the Ubar, her voice loud, clear, and imperious. She seemed to have no fear of Nar, perhaps because of the familiarity of the citizens of Ar with the spider people. But it was most obvious that she loathed the touch of those mandibles, and she shivered as she tried to wipe the exudate from the sleeves of her gown. "Also," said Nar, "she speaks rather loudly for a rational creature, does she not?" "Yes," I said. I regarded the daughter of the Ubar, now a sorry sight. Her robes of concealment were splattered with mud and marsh water, and in several places the heavy brocade had stiffened and cracked. The dominant colors of her robes of concealment were several reds, yellows, and purples, arrayed in intricate overlapping folds. I guess it would have taken her slave girls hours to array her in such garments. Many of the free women of Gor, and almost always those of high caste, wear the robes of concealment, though of course their garments are seldom as complex or splendidly wrought as those of an Ubar's daughter. The robes of concealment in function resembled the garments of the Muslim women upon my own planet, though they are undoubtedly more intricate and cumbersome. Normally with men, only a father and a husband may look upon the woman unveiled. In the barbaric world of Gor, the robes of concealment are deemed necessary to protect the women from the binding fires of roving Tarnsmen. Few warriors will risk their lives to capture a woman who might be as ugly as a Thalian. Better to steal slaves, where the guilt is less, and the charms of the captive are more readily ascertainable in advance. Now the eyes of the daughter of the Ubar were blazing at me furiously from those narrow apertures in her veil. I noted that they were greenish in cast, fiery and untamed, the eyes of an Ubar's daughter, a girl accustomed to the commanding men. I also noted, though with considerably less pleasure, that the daughter of the Ubar was several inches taller than myself. Indeed, her body seemed to be out of proportions. "You will release me immediately," announced the daughter of the Ubar, "and dismiss this filthy insect." "Spiders are, as a matter of fact, particularly clean insects," I remarked, my eyes informing her that I was inspecting her own comparatively filthy garments. She shrugged heartily. "Where's the Tarn?" I demanded. "You should ask," she spoke, Where is the homestone of Ar? Where is the Tarn? I repeated, more interested in the moment in the fate of my fierce mount than in some ridiculous piece of arc that I had risked my life to obtain. I don't know, she said, nor do I care. What happened? I wanted to know. I do not care to be questioned further, she announced. I clenched my fists in a rage. Gently, the mandibles of Nar closed around the girl's throat. A sudden tremor of fear shook her heavily robed body, and the girl's hands tried to force those implacable chitinous pincers from her throat. Apparently, a spider person was not as harmless as she had arrogantly assumed. Tell it to stop, she gasped, withering in the insect's grip, her fingers helplessly trying to loosen those mandibles. Do you wish her head? Asked the mechanical voice of Nar. I knew that the insect, who would allow his kind to be exterminated before he would injure a rational creature, must have a plan in mind. Or at least I seemed he did, at any rate. I spoke yes, and the mandibles began to close upon her throat like blades of a giant scissor. Stop! Screamed the girl, her voice a frenzied whisper. I motioned at Nar to relax his grip. I was trying to bring the Tarn back to Ar, said the girl. I was never on a Tarn before. I made mistakes. I knew there was no Tarn code. I gestured, and Nar removed his mandibles from the girl's throat. We were somewhere over the swamp forest, said the girl. We flew into a flock of wild Torns. My Tarn attacked the leader of the flock. She shuddered at the memory, and I pitied her for what must have been a horrifying experience, lashed helplessly to the saddle of a giant Tarn, reeling in a death struggle for mastery of a flock, high over the trees of those swampy forests. My Tarn killed the other, said the girl, and followed it to the ground, where he tore it to pieces. She shook with the memory. I slipped free, and I ran under the wing and hid in the trees. After a few minutes, his beak and talons were wet with blood. Your Tarn then took flight. I last saw him at the head of the Tarn flock. Well, that was that, I thought. The Tarn was now wild. His instincts had triumphed over the Tarn whistle, the memory of men. And the homestone of Ar? I asked. In the saddle pack, she said, confirming my expectation. I had locked the pack when I had placed the homestone inside, and the pack is a part of the Tarn saddle. When she had spoken, her voice had burned with shame. I sensed that humiliation she felt at having failed to save the homestone. Now the Tarn was gone, returned to his natural wild state, and the homestone was in the saddle pack. I had failed. The daughter of the Ubar had failed. We stood facing one another on a green knoll upon the swamp forest of Ar.